So I want to talk about these solutions using the solution PDF already provided. Just cover some of these things in, voice, and then also make some more general statements that you can't really put in a PDF, or at least you could, but then everything gets crowded and nobody reads it anyway. So for the first problem, compounds versus phrases, part A was compound or phrase. And you had a couple tests in the slides, and there was another test that was sort of hidden in the slides that you might have realized you could use, maybe not. So the first one, of course, is separability. So with a word like dumbass, you can't really say a dumb looking for trouble ass. It's no longer the interpretation you're going for if you do separate it with something in between, and it does sound a little odd. So you cannot do that with compounds, but you could separate phrases. Dumbass is also idiomatic. It's not a literal ass, although that could be argued. So you might actually see it as a head. And when you use coordination, I hit the smart ass and the dumb one, you don't get that meaning of dumbass. You get a literal interpretation. In fact, when you hear smart ass and the dumb one, you might even think of it as just dumb person rather than dumbass, like a different sort of connotation there. So in that case, this is all evidence that this is a compound. So I say this is exocentric because it's not literal, but you might argue that this is endocentric if you think that this is short for like the description of a person. And the tree is on the right, so if it's endocentric, it has a head. If it is not endocentric, it does not have a head. Okay, SoundCloud wrapper. Not much to say here. The tests are pretty similar. A SoundCloud professional wrapper sounds pretty bad, so you can't separate it. I found the SoundCloud wrapper and the new one. This sounds okay. Coordination sounds okay. What you might not have realized is that compounds also are a result of lexical integrity, so we can use those tests too. So any sort of movement tests we can do with our compounds. And if we could move part of a compound, then we know that there's no lexical integrity there. So it was a SoundCloud that I knew wrapper. If we separate them with movement and only move SoundCloud up, it's bad. But if I say it was a SoundCloud wrapper that I knew and the whole thing moves up together, so it was originally after no, then it's fine. But we can't separate it with that clefting. This is called a cleft construction. So that sort of movement test is also acceptable for determining phrase or compound. And this is endocentric. It's a type of wrapper. So our tree looks like this. SoundCloud should be separated. Wrapper is a right head. If you think of the cloud as being like the cloud in technology, then you could say that SoundCloud is also endocentric. But if you're thinking about a literal cloud, no, that's not the case. Hard hat could be either. Hard could describe the property of a hat and be an adjp attached to an n, or it could be a compound if you refer to the actual hard hat on the head. Now, both things actually describe the same thing, so either way you put it would be fine. It's both. It could just depend on the inflection. Sorry, not the inflection, the intonation in your voice when you say it. Oh, he's wearing a hard hat. Oh, he's wearing a hard hat. That's what's going to come down to whether it's a phrase or a compound. For extraterrestrial being, extra here is a prefix, not meaning like more, as in like an additional one. So this is just like beyond, the prefix beyond. So this is a phrase. So you could say like an extraterrestrial mermaid-like being. You could give more specifics after it. So this says that you can separate extraterrestrial from being. You could say the being was extraterrestrial. So this is a form with an adjective in it. The being was extraterrestrial. You couldn't say the teacher was math, but you can say the teacher was old. So in this case, the teacher was extraterrestrial. This is evidence through movement or through a similar construction that this is actually an adjective. I met an aquatic being and an extraterrestrial one. This is fine. This does not change the interpretation. You still get that this is a being, this is some alien. So this is actually just a phrase. You don't have to worry about endocentricity, exocentricity, or even drawing the tree. This is just what it would look like. Now for Burnaby Village Museum staff, you can do the test. You can find that maybe some areas can sound like decent, but usually separating any of these doesn't sound great. So no matter which structure you look for, in the end, it's going to be a compound. There are a lot of tests to show. If you didn't show them all, obviously, that's a lot. Most, well, if not all of them, are endocentric. I will read your arguments to see how you're writing about them, and all the meanings are very similar. So if you came up with difficulty struggling to determine the different meanings, I understand, and I expect that I'll see that in writing. So sort of what are the lessons that you get from this problem is that even if you have one of these complex compounds with so many different structures and different meanings according to structures, the meanings in practicality and in use might actually all be identical. So theoretically, 5 different structures are available, but in terms of meaning, we only ever need one because they're all the same. So these are the 5 different orders for Burnaby Village Museum staff. So the double arrows are the heads, and every single node is a noun, of course, because these are all nouns and they will always form nouns. Now in question 2, for the Clitics versus Inflection for ul, which is the short form for will, we have some tests. So a low degree of selection with will. So the man will leave, this is a noun. I'll leave, this is a pronoun. The kid I'm watching will fall, so you can do a verb there. The thing walking by will pick up dust. This is a preposition here. So there's low selective criteria here for ul. That's what we get from A. From B, arbitrary gaps. Well, as far as I know, there's no gaps. I can't go through every single word in English and pick them out, but if you have examples, then maybe you have an example there, and that would provide evidence in the other direction. But as far as I know, there are no gaps. Any place where you have will, you can shorten to ul. For the pronunciation or form, it's always ul. It's always a syllabic ul when it's attached to another form. You might get a schwa in there, but not all speakers will even pronounce that schwa. So, like, you'll do it. That's sort of Philadelphian English. Use meaning you all, or multiple you. You'll do it. So you might get that schwa there. In terms of semantic idiosyncrasies, I think it's always the same. This is hard to test, and it's the same problem as C in a way, but C, it's easier to run through the words and think about how pronunciation of the ul could go. With D, it's difficult to think of all the possible combinations, but will usually always has that same meaning of in the future. And when that operates with negation, sometimes you have some ambiguity there, but that's an interaction in semantics. So that's why I say D is hard, because you could find one counterexample and suddenly it goes in the other direction, but I'm not aware of any counterexample to this. So in E, for syntactic processes can fix affix words, but not clitic groups. This is hard to do in English because will is the head of the TP. So, or in syntax, like part of the verb phrase, it's part of the predicate. And when it contracts, it becomes that ul form. It attaches to a subject. So you can't really do movement tests because you have a predicate element on a subject. So what is there to move? Like, that's the whole unit. If you compare it to like the nt in didn't, that was in the VP. So you could still do movement because you're not touching the subject. So I'll see what you do, but what you're probably not doing is what the process is asking you to do. What you've probably done, if you've done some movement, is shown like a stranded ol out front in a sentence. And that's not quite what you should be doing if you did that. But I'll take a look at what you've done, just because I'm interested in what you've seen and what you've concluded from it. But E was also incredibly difficult, well, if not impossible to do. And in F, we have to assume that the apostrophe S for possessive is a clitic, and we can create a form like Stevens will be here soon, like Stevens will be here soon, like his possession will be here soon, and we can see that it attaches to another clitic. So the evidence here suggests that yes, this is a clitic rather than an affix. So, interesting problem. Number 3, why is he the accused? I say you're gonna I told you. It's not that it's you're overcomplicating it. Why does dog have the accusative case? Well, because this is a causative construction and the dog isn't the one making itself run. So the dog has become the object. The dog was the subject in the passive, but in causatives, a new subject comes in and the old subject gets demoted. So dog gets the accusative case because dog is now the object after subject demotion. That's it. The lesson here is that case assignment is not kept through transformations. Only the semantic roles are kept. So in English, he found me, I was found by him. We have some transfers here. Me becomes I and he becomes him. So shouldn't say him here is accusative. This is, well, it looks like an accusative. This is really a well, prepositional case. So he was nominative subject, but in the passive he is, or him is accusative because it's no longer the subject. It's about position. While I is now the subject, which used to be me in the original sentence as the object. So case is assigned after transformations. That's the point of the question. That's why it was 1%. You probably overcomplicated this if you got it wrong. And for problem 4, we have the middle voice. So Kim opened the door as active, the door was opened by Kim as passive, and the door opened, so you notice there's no auxiliary here, is what's called the middle voice. So the difference between the active voice is that the active has a transitive verb, so has a subject and object. There's an actor as a subject and an actee as its object. So this could be the theme of the sentence. Now in the middle voice, the door opened, you have an intransitive verb with a subject that has the theme as its subject. So the door opened. The door is the thing that opened in this case. So it is the thing that is being acted upon. And what's interesting about these middle verbs is that not only could it be a theme, but in terms of the meaning, it is possible to derive it from a sentence like the door opened itself. So it could come from a reflexive sentence where you had an agent and a theme and the subject had both of those roles. So that's just a little aside there. So when we draw our word schema, well, we've seen the active and passive. So I just have the regular active and passive over on the left. I don't have any of the meanings written in because it's English. And here is what the middle passive looks like. It has a subject that is a theme. But what you notice here is that it doesn't have an optional agent. And that is because the middle voice does not take an optional agent. You cannot say the door opened by Fred to mean that Fred opened the door. That means it opened beside the door because there's no was there in English. The door opened specifies that there's a theme and there may have been a cause, there may not have been a cause. Maybe the door is the opener of itself. It is unspecified. So actually, these are different constructions. And if we alternate with any passive construction, this means that any passive could become a middle voice. And we don't, well, we might not see that. We may not see that. But more importantly, we could say that these come from sentences of the form, like, as I said before, let's say you have X with a verb, you have a subject, which is an agent, and then you have itself later in the sentence, which is also a theme. So I really should call this an object, and the object and subject happen to be linked to the same thing. So we could have some sort of weird look like this. I'm just trying to explain this in words in a structure. So that's sort of where it comes from. This is a difficult problem. So I'm going to see what you wrote and be pretty generous when I take a look at how you're linking things. But this feeds into question 3, so I'll treat these two as a unit to see if you're consistent and go from there. But this helps explain 3 quite easily for the train arrived. Because in this case, with arrival, this is more of an experience. So it doesn't fit the same thematic role as the door in opened. And maybe that might not be a convincing enough argument for why this won't affect what's happening. First of all, they're not linked. So if you don't link your things, you're not going to get this passive form that you shouldn't be getting. But you can also just consider the fact that arrived doesn't have a transitive form. So that is another reason why we don't want to link all of our forms where like we have the train arrived with just a single subject with an intransitive verb. We don't want to say that there's some transitive form that can be made from putting it back to some active. So that's how we know this is a middle, and this is why we're not going to get the passive. So very tough question, I know, and I will be quite generous looking at this one. I think the idea behind asking the question is a very like down to earth, and it looks like a very straightforward problem, and then you actually analyze and look at things in morphology and put all the pieces together, and it's not something that immediately comes together. So I underestimated that part a little bit on your end, so I apologize for, I think a couple of people expressed like a lot of frustrations with this problem. So good attempts, and I'll see what you've done. So if you have any questions, as always, you know where to find me, and you know how to ask stuff. Sorry, I didn't know how to end that sentence, so there you go. That's the end of the video.